I'm Jeff Goebel. I'm another founder of the New Mexico Healthy Soil Working Group. I have a small farm in the Rio Grande Valley. I've been practicing the 5 principles of soil health here for 5 years now. I began my work with soil health about in the 1980s, and it's been a passion of love and adventure. Just briefly, the soil stories is what we're calling these. Is that we're planning on having this be a feature on a regular basis to honor people who have a passion for the practice of the 5 principles of soil health in some manner and whatnot, whether they're writing books about this work and meeting people from all over the place and networking, or they're actually practicing on the land. The idea is to just share experiences that we all have and whatnot. And I'd just like to move to introducing Judy. She's a friend of mine. I've found her to be brilliant and just a lovely personality. I've known her for years through her books, but I finally got to meet her about 3 years ago, I think it was, in Mexico, and it's been a great honor since that time. She's a writer, researcher, networker, and just a plain good person. So I'm honored to introduce Judy, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thanks to all of you for inviting me to share my soil story. We all have stories. We all have a different relationship to the land. Some of you work on the land directly, and I guess we could call my story how this desk-bound journalist came to love the soil. So that's my story. And just so you all know, I'm here, I'm almost all the way across the country in Bennington, Vermont. So you may notice that my light is different from your light. I mean, the sun is going down, and I'm very fortunate that I live in a place with a western view. So I can almost see New Mexico there. But anyway, I see the sun is going down, and it's beautiful. So that's what's happening in the background in my universe. So yeah, so my story, as I was mentioning earlier, I used to write about all different kinds of things. I wrote women's magazine articles. If you ever wonder who wrote those 3 shrink pieces, he loves me not, maybe he, whatever, just those kinds of articles. Well, yeah, I used to do those. So anyway, if we go back in ancient history to the last recession, I had a lot of time on my hands, like many of us, and I started asking some questions, and that launched me on a whirlwind journalistic tour of new economics, which is the notion that the economy can and should serve people and the planet, instead of having a scenario where people and the planet exist to serve the economy. So that was a compelling idea, and the articles that I wrote brought me into very interesting lines of inquiry, such as why is nature not given any value in the GDP, our economic model? What is the nature of wealth? And how does buying local help the economy? So lots of different interesting areas. So, I'm trotting around, writing articles, and I ended up in the northern part of Vermont at a conference, and there was a guy that was talking about soil, okay? So I have to say, I'm kind of rolling my eyes, and I'm saying, okay, right, soil is a metaphor for local economies. Okay, all right, well, let's get over the soil stuff and let's get to the real stuff. And then he said something that would not let me go. And that was that over time, more CO2 has come from the disturbance of soil compared to the burning of fossil fuels. And that just absolutely, just hit me over the head. And because I was in this journalistic reporting, researching mode, I had to understand this better. So I started exploring soil. I started looking up material about soil. What does it do? How does it function in the environment? What is its role? And as I kept going, I got more and more excited because it seemed to me as I went along that soil had a positive role to play in virtually every one of our global challenges. So, I mean, it seemed almost too good to be true. So soil is essential for managing water because healthy soil creates a sponge. So that meant resilience in the face of flooding or drought or wildfires. It was when you hydrate the land, you were less prone to wildfire. And it had a role to play in climate because we're drawing down carbon into the soil. That's where the carbon wants to be. The carbon cycle is out of balance. And also biodiversity starts in the soil. Soil is the essence of wealth. What we produce comes from the soil. So anyway, I was on a roll. So I wrote a book called Cows Save the Planet and Other Improbable Ways of Restoring Soil to Heal the Earth. So what compelled me then, after finishing that book, because I just don't know how to stop. What compelled me then was water, because I felt that this was during the time that people were very concerned about the California drought. And I was struck by two things. One is that whenever people were talking about the problem of drought, they were always talking about what does or doesn't come down from the sky. I see a question, but we'll get there. Okay, I don't know if I articulated that, from agricultural practices. Okay, so it was always about what does or doesn't come down from the sky, but the state of the soil has everything to do with whether the land is hydrated, whether there's enough water, what happens to that water when it hits the ground, whether it streams away, goes into, across the parking lots, across the built environment and picking up pollutants on the way and into the ocean, or whether it is held in the soil to nourish plant life and microbial life. So, and the other thing that interested me a great deal was that whenever we talked about the connection between water and climate, the conversation only went in one direction. And that was that climate change will put added stress on water resources throughout the world. And that is a very important point. But no one was discussing the role that water plays in terms of climate. Because if you look at how the earth manages heat, much of this is from water-based processes, how water conveys and releases and absorbs heat energy. So through all the water processes, through the transpiration and evaporation cycle, and the extent to which water is infiltrated in the landscape, which supports photosynthesis and all of those processes. So that's what compelled me to write the next book, which is Water in Plain Sight, so Hope for a Thirsty World. So now I'm going to attempt a technological marvel, which is shifting to the slides, because I want to share with you a little bit from my reporting, because it's one thing to learn all this as concepts, but to actually go out in the field and witness what soil health can do in the landscape. That was really, really powerful. First, I need to preface this, that the place that I went is I received a grant from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting to go to Zimbabwe and learn about the land management being done at the Africa Center for Holistic Management and in the villages, through the rural villages in Zimbabwe, through the Africa Center. So I just want to make sure, I imagine that most people in this group have some sense of holistic planned grazing. Please correct me if I'm wrong, and if I need to go into a little bit of a discussion of that. Jeff, Isabel?
You might just say something brief about it, just in case.
Okay. Okay. So when I embarked on this question about bringing carbon back into the soil, at that point, the only people who were talking about it were people in the realm of holistic management, holistic planned grazing. And basically, what they came to understand is that in a functioning ecosystem, animals play a huge role in bringing carbon into the soil. So we'll just take cattle for an example. So the cattle, they are moving and they are pressing decaying plant matter into the ground, so that plant matter can be worked on by microorganisms to be incorporated into the soil, adding carbon to the soil. And their waste adds carbon and fertility and nutrients into the soil. So the key is that in the wild, ruminants would be kept on the move by predators so that they were never on the land, any spot of land for too long. However, in our current environment, there are few places where animals are interacting in a state of wildness at that level. So because we don't have the natural predator connections because of our built environment, our roads, our cities, and all. So, and the lesser number of wild predators. So in the absence of wild predators, humans can serve as the predators in the landscape, moving the cattle or the sheep or the goats or apparently the camels in a way so that they are kept on the move as if they were fleeing predators. Just a nod if you think that's okay for me to move on. Okay, now to this incredible feat of technology. Did I share the screen? There
you go.
Okay, do you have the first slide?
You just
Yes,
have to, yeah.
Woo! Wow, amazing. So I just have to make sure, okay, I got it. I have the arrows. I like arrows. I understand they are self-explanatory. Okay, so this picture, we are in Zimbabwe now. And this is the Dimbengombe River at the Africa Center. The river runs along past the Africa Center for Holistic Management. And this was actually really incredible to see because this river, I guess it took about 20 years. This river now runs a full kilometer higher into the catchment than it did before the use of holistic planned grazing. So the banks have stabilized. So on their own, if the cattle would have been left on their own, they would have been nibbling and grazing right up to the banks, and we would have seen erosion. They would have been hanging around the banks because that's a kind of nice place to be because you've got water. But because they were kept on the move, they were not overgrazing at that spot. So the banks could stabilize. And what happened was that they had grasses, and then they had sedges and reeds, which are wetland plants. So a whole wetland ecosystem returned. And for in terms of the other wildlife, this meant that the elephants, that not only did it extend into the catchment, but also the river flowed all the way through the year, as opposed to only during the rainy season. So that meant that the elephants who like to water in this area could depend on this water instead of having to traipse long distances for permanent springs. Okay. Next. So I also did some reporting and visited villages that the Africa Center was working with. And this was from a village called, I think this is Sizinda, but I was particularly struck by a village called Sianyanga, where working with the Africa Center made a huge difference in their lives. So they studied a little bit of how doing holistic planned grazing enhanced the water infiltration of their soil on their crop fields. And while that doesn't sound that exciting, water infiltration, what this meant was that they were able to grow crops for 7 months of the year instead of only 2 months of the year during the rainy season. And what this meant was that they could be self-sustaining rather than depending on international food aid. And I learned from these people firsthand just how much pride that gave them, because it is no fun to be on food aid. So they told me stories. They were so thrilled by how their work with the animals enabled them to be self-sufficient. So not only in terms of food, but in terms of the thatch to fix their huts and everything. They were wonderful people. It was really a gift to be there. And then biodiversity. So these are sable antelope, which I think are the most beautiful animals. And in many of the national parks in Southern Africa, their numbers are dwindling, unfortunately. And the people at, say, the Kruger Park in South Africa say that they don't know why. However, we know that these animals thrive in a landscape where there's a diversity of grasses. So this was just a very short walk from where we were staying. And on our little bushwalks led by a local villager, we saw several healthy herds of sable antelope with young. So that speaks very well for the health of this population. So the healthy soil helps sustain the water cycle, which helps sustain the biodiversity, the plants, which helps sustain the biodiversity. So yeah, what I'd like to show this picture because, you know, we've got two universes. Okay, so this shows on the right side, I'm assuming that you see it in the same side as I do. We have healthy grasses, holistically managed land with healthy grasses. And on the left side, we have land that could be undergrazed or overgrazed, and in any event, it's desertified landscapes. And on the left side, they're losing water from evaporation, or it's streaming off because the ground does not have, it's not a carbon sponge, so it cannot hold water in the same way. And in the left, you're also losing carbon as it oxidizes into the atmosphere. And on the right, we're holding water and absorbing carbon. And one reason that I like to show this slide is that many people will look at the left and say, maybe conclude that this is a consequence of climate change. What I like to highlight is that these kinds of landscapes are a contributor to climate change, because what happens with desertified landscapes is that the ground heats up. It becomes a hot, kind of a hot plate. And when the soil temperature heats up, the microorganisms can't survive. There's not enough water. And when water actually is above, I mean, this kind of landscape, the heat of it repels precipitating clouds that would offer precipitation. So I just think that that's a really important thing to understand. And because we know that we can rehabilitate large-scale desertified landscapes, that's worth paying attention to, rather than shrugging our shoulders and say, oh, well, it's always been that way, or, oh, it's a consequence of external problems. It's really a matter of management. So now I'm shifting gears, and I'm just going to show you 2 slides from my next book, which is coming out in September. And the new book is about the global ecosystem restoration movement. And this is a movement that is growing. So as I said, we know that we can restore large-scale damaged ecosystems. One barrier to that, taking that action, is that many people don't know that's even a possibility. So it's important to bring those stories out to show that it is possible, so we can begin to imagine the future that we can create by restoring ecosystems. So in this book, so the book is called The Reindeer Chronicles, and other stories of working with nature to heal the earth. And one story takes place in New Mexico, and I tell the tale of a workshop, one of Jeff's workshops that I attended, in which we observed a community move from a state of conflict to a state not only of commitment to working out differences within the community, but moving beyond that to taking care of the land, something that they didn't realize they had an opportunity to do because they were so mired in their difficulties. So that's very exciting. So I just want to give you a little, this is the last thing, I just want to give you a little hint of the kinds of amazing things, stories that are out there. Okay, so there's this fellow that you see here named Neil Spackman, and he's an American who happened to study the Arabic language when he was in college, just certain questions that he was asking himself at the time. And the opportunity came up to basically that there was a housing and economic development program among impoverished Bedouin in Western Saudi Arabia. And he had been studying permaculture, and because he happened to be able to speak the language, they kind of snapped him up, and he joined the project because he was willing to live full-time on the land with the community in Saudi Arabia. And so he brought a permaculture perspective. And what's really amazing is that, so this is a place where you may get like, 3 inches of rain, and then you may wait 3 years before there's any more rain. But what he and his team did was they made sure to capture every bit of rain and hold it in weirs and in different kind of water harvesting techniques, different things that they built. And they held all the rain and they planted trees. And what I will leave you with is this amazing thing that happened, was that so from about 2010, 11 on, they were planting trees whenever it rained, and that wasn't so often. A couple of years did go by without it, but they were collecting irrigation water. Then the funding for this project dried up. And Neil and the team said, oh, well, it was, so they were no longer able to do irrigation. But what happened was that after they stopped irrigation, 80% of those trees survived, which is extraordinary because they were able to build the biological systems that they created the conditions for those conditions to support the trees the mycelium, the carbon in the soil, and on for those trees to survive. So I just think that's a fabulous story. And I'll just show you one more, that this is an example of how they were able to slow down the water. And Neil has a very interesting definition of a desert. It's not a function of how much rain you get, but rather a desert is a place where when it rains, it floods. Because once it no longer floods and you can capture the rain, it is no longer a desert. So that's what's happening in Western Saudi Arabia. And I will leave you with a woodland flower in Vermont. I don't know if you have those in New Mexico, but they are flowering now here on my land. And when you come upon them, it's like magic. So that's all. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions.
Very good. If anyone has questions, you can put them in the chat. I am Christina All-Day Bondi. I'm another member of the Healthy Soils Working Group in New Mexico. I live on 5 acres and have Navajo Churro sheep, which I do I guess, a fair job of moving appropriately to improve the health of the soil.
So would you like me to read the questions from the chat, or Christina, are you going to?
I will look for them and read them. Is there anyone of the working group members who had a question that we could take right now while folks are getting their thoughts together?
There's 2 of them right there that are good in the chat.
Okay. Let's see. Aaron is asking about notes for the call. Aaron, we are going to transfer the recording of this to YouTube, and you'll be free to go back and look at it on YouTube at your leisure. Gregory is mentioning that one of the local ag extension agents had said that the deadliest implement humans ever invented is the plow. And Judith, you might want to comment on that.
I would certainly agree. And one of my colleagues, a fellow author named David Montgomery, has written a book that is basically an entire book on that concept. And that is called Growing a Revolution. And so the plow disturbs the soil. So in nature, nothing is so simple. There is optimal disturbance. Soil needs to be disturbed occasionally. We could think about the movement, the trampling of ruminants as a kind of disturbance, but the plow is a heavy disturbance in a way that leaves soil uncovered. Well, it basically transgresses all of the healthy soil principles. So yes.
Okay, thank you. Kendra, we're going to try to unmute you so you can ask your question directly.
Oh my. Hi, thank you so much. I have a lot of background noise, so apologies for that. I was just wondering, Judith, I noticed in one of the photos there appeared to be some ranchers, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role that ranchers can play in soil remediation in areas where there's been, sort of historic overgrazing.
Yes, ranchers can really turn it around on the land that they are working on by working with the land, managing the animals in a way that mimics the behavior of the animals in the wild by acting as the predator. So what just popped into my head, and I don't know if this is exactly flows, but there's someone that I wrote about, a farmer in Australia who manages a tract of land the size of the 5 boroughs of New York. This is in the Kimberley, in the way north of Australia. And one can, you can't get there by road. One can only fly in. So he's a real interesting character. So 2 things that he said. So one, he talks about cattle as, and the purpose of his operation is to restore the land. His product is restored land. He talks about cattle as power tools. And like a power tool, it can be incredibly effective and productive if used correctly, and incredibly damaging if deployed incorrectly. Then he also talks about humans as upper management, the animals as middle management, plants as lower management, and the workers are all the microorganisms. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, because it gives the sense of those plants having agency. And from my reporting, I see the plants have more agency than we tend to give them credit for. So they too are the workers. I don't know if that answered your question, but many ranchers are applying holistic planned grazing to their land, and many are getting incredible results, and I absolutely applaud that. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Kendra, I'm not sure what part of the state you're in, but we know of holistic management ranchers in various places across New Mexico who are doing the work and are getting some really nice results. Let's see, it looks like Sylvia, did you have a question that you wanted to share?
I'm just kind of learning how to do this. How do I unmute myself? I don't see this.
You are unmuted.
I am? Oh, okay. All right. My name is Sylvia Ernestina Vergara, and I love my farm. And I'm actually doing planting. I just put in a cover crop in certain areas, and I don't use any chemicals or sprays. So I think my question is, and especially for farmers like myself, I am also part of the Acequia Association, which is fabulous and wonderful. And I love that association. And so my question is how do these small family farms, and that is what I am, a small farmer, how do we, because I would definitely like to be able to use these techniques. I have heard that there is something like a chisel plow that doesn't turn the soil, it just sort of breaks it up. But you know, those pieces of equipment are very expensive. And you know, you would have a whole bunch of people on your side if we had well, not necessarily the funds, but if people made it so that we could afford to buy that stuff. And, you know, and we would put in those green manures, you know, a lot of that, you know, farming is expensive. And I think like to really do this quickly and to move quickly, that we need to be empowered. We need to have these tools put into our hands in a way in which we can reach out and afford to have them as a part of our tool inventory. So my question is how do you think that can happen?
Wow, it's a huge question. So my understanding is that something like a chisel plow might only need to be used once. because it breaks up the soil, and I think it's kind of similar to, sorry, I'm smiling, my dog is walking around. It's similar to a yeoman's plow. So I guess the question I would raise is, are there opportunities for farmers to band together and share equipment like that, or to have some kind of cooperative? I mean, that seems like that there would be a lot of positive to come out of that. Also, there's a fellow I know, he has a farm in New Hampshire, and his name is Dorn Cox. And he's someone who is has a real techie mind. And he created a program called Farm Hack, which gives people ideas of how to kind of build tools, how to take one tool and maybe fix it up so it can be used for something else. And I think there's a whole network involved in that movement. But I know that there are people who are very aware of the importance of having these tools available to more people. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay. Jeff, would you know some about what's going on in New Mexico around tool sharing? You want to chime in with that?
Well, I don't, I know the conservation districts have equipment that's available, and that's a real good, so I don't, so I think, there are districts that already have equipment. And if, you're most likely in a conservation district, so you could actually ask your conservation district if they could get equipment that could be utilized. And so that might help, take care of, the costs. And you're absolutely right about it. There's Dr. Christine Jones talked back in February, and she showed a graph about how net farm income's going down, yet farm receipts are going up. And that space, a lot of that is the input costs to do agriculture. And that input cost has basically replaced the soil microbes that Judy was talking about. So the opportunity with healthy soils is bring back the soil microbes so they can do a lot of the work, like fertilizing, water retention, water infiltration, pest and insect control, things like that. So yeah, but I think that may be a real good. Brent Van Dyke's on the line here too, and he works. He's actually been the past president of the National Association of Conservation Districts, and so anyway, I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Brent, about that idea of conservation districts helping out.
Sure, if it's okay. I am Brent Van Dyke, Government Affairs Director for our State Association of Conservation Districts. And to tag on to that last conversation, many of the soil and water districts throughout New Mexico, the 47 conservation districts, a lot of them do have equipment that is available to those small producers. My local district has no-till drills, minimum till drills, lots of tillage equipment that I think will assist in developing those microorganisms so in the soil. So I think the step one hopefully would be to contact your local conservation district. And maybe every conservation district does not do the leasing program for the small producers, but I in southern New Mexico, I know my district does. Lots of the districts do, and in northern New Mexico, you might, if you live in Santa Fe, you might have to go to Espanola, because I know that conservation district does have equipment that is available to those producers, especially small producers who can't afford the equipment. So those programs are available.
Thank you, Brent. I'll add that there is also someone in New Mexico who will come in on a contract basis, and has a yeoman's plow. Will do that for you if that is of interest. That would be Gordon Tooley of Tooley's Trees, and you can find him online. Tooley is Tooley. Let's see, and I want to remind everybody that their chat function is down there in the center of your little bar at the bottom, and if you have questions, you can put it in there. Let's see, and I want to go to Maury and let you ask a couple questions. Looks like you've got several.
Oops. Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes, and if you'll turn on your camera so we can see you, that would be great.
Okay. Let's see. Hi. Okay. Yeah, so thanks again. I guess I'm switching gears a little bit here, but my question is a little bit related to the talk that Christine Jones gave earlier in this year, and you reference her in your book. And she kind of brings up this sort of controversial point, but also a really compelling point about sort of the relationship between the water cycle and climate change, and the relationship between the water cycle and the carbon cycle. And you discuss it a little bit in your book, but I think it's also kind of, and it's a really important theme, I think, to dig into a little bit more, and sort of how that relates to parts of the carbon cycle that aren't directly related to soil, like fossil fuel extraction and things like that, and how can we kind of move the conversation into a place where we can talk about those two cycles sort of simultaneously rather than having it be either or. So I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, anything we have will be great.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly makes sense to me, and it often really has, it strikes me as kind of folly to think about that, to really only talk about the carbon cycle in terms of climate change, as if there were a dial, and if the carbon level goes up, this happens. Anyway, that's my thought. Yeah, I'm struggling how, so with fossil fuels, I mean, that the reason we call them fossil fuels is that it's the product of ancient photosynthesis, and that's built that's in the ground and has built the wealth of our soils. I'm having a hard time knowing how to answer that, because I feel like there's something that Christine said that perhaps you would be best to share.
Well, I think maybe to start things off a little bit, Dr. Jones sort of made a stronger statement that the water cycle, or the unbalanced water cycle, is the underlying cause of climate change. Whereas in your book, you kind of say, yes, it's related, but there's a lot of different factors. But I think that during the seminar, it was something that got a lot of people riled up for arguably good reason. So I'm sort of wondering if you have thoughts on that sort of underlying argument, and even if it's productive to have it, I don't know.
Yeah, I would say that to me, the more interesting question is, how does the biosphere work? To really ask, to look at what we're dealing with and how, as opposed to either or, because I would say that they work in tandem, the carbon cycle and the water cycle. But because I'm a journalist, I defer, and I learn from my sources, and I often defer to them. And I will tell you that when one place that I visited for this new book is Spain, and I spent several days with a really interesting scientist named Mian Mian. And so he's been working on researching the loss of the summer rains in the Western Mediterranean. And so he's talking about, what I focus a lot on is the impacts of land use change. So that's what he has been looking at. Basically, what has been done to the landscape in the Western Mediterranean near Valencia, where he lives, is that whole, section of the Mediterranean, is that the land has been, the wetlands have been built over, land has been paved over, built up, and so you're not getting the plants sending up more moisture through transpiration that actually was necessary to create the regular rains that the farmers in the region had depended on. So that's what his research is. But the reason that I bring him up now is that what he says, and he's been studying this and studying land and climate and all of this since the 1970s, is that he says that the climate impacts that we are seeing now, which we generally attribute to a kind of vague realm of climate change, he says are local impacts running wild. That we think that it's this big, scary, amorphous thing, and when it's that big, it's always else. It's usually elsewhere. He's talking about that what we're seeing is the result of distorted carbon and water cycles locally and regionally. And by restoring the carbon and water cycles locally and regionally, we can reinstate, at least to some extent, the tradition, what had been the regular weather patterns. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. To Willows Farm. You had a question. Isabel, can you unmute Sharon over there?
To Willows, you're on.
Oh, it sounds like Two Willows has no audio.
Need to unmute yourself.
They are unmuted, so I don't know.
Okay.
Oh, maybe no mic. Maybe Two Willows Farm is on a phone.
Okay, she doesn't have, okay. All right, well, you want to take, I'm sorry, if you would repeat your question into the chat, it sort of rolled past me, and I don't seem to be able to get back to it. We're all a little challenged by this technology. In the meantime, Gregory, did you have another comment or question you wanted to ask?
Oh, no, not really. I just was commenting.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so Two Willows Farm, okay.
There we go. You want to go, so Two Willows, you don't currently use livestock, but you're wondering if you have any experience in using biochar for carbon sequestering. We are using cover crop to improve water retention and are in our second planting year.
So personally, I don't have experience with biochar. I do know many people who think that it's an important part of the whole rebalancing the carbon cycle scenario, and that it has very important uses on farms. I also know people who are very wary and say that it has to be done in a certain way. So because I know people across the spectrum, and I don't have personal experience, I tend not to say much more than that.
Okay. Well, as it turns out, Dr. David Johnson of NMSU, who's been doing a lot of research in this area, is on the line with us. David, would you
Really?
like to chime in?
What was the question? I'm in the middle of cutting up
It
the
was
cake.
about using biochar for carbon sequestering, and they're wondering about anybody's experience with using biochar.
Well, from what I've seen and heard, talked to some people that have applied it, talked to some manufacturers, you can only apply up to 15 tons per acre, and then you start to see a negative effect as far as plant growth. But to try to reframe the picture, when you put in biochar, it's not functional carbon. It's amorphous carbon. And what you want to get back into that soil is a functional carbon, a carbon in the form of the microbes that help you start to mine the elements out of that soil parent material so the plant has access. A functioning system is what you really want to bring back. And biochar doesn't give you that. Your cover crops, bringing your microbiota back as best you can is what rebuilds these systems and rebuilds the carbon and makes it a functional carbon.
Okay. Thank you, David.
So I do want to just say to everybody, I don't know if you all know David, but in New Mexico, you are so lucky to have him and Huichan Su, because their work is pioneering. And it has huge implications on both reviving degraded soils, on building carbon sequestration, and growing very vigorous plants. So yeah, they're on it. They're on the edge, the cutting edge.
Okay. Thank you. Sharon, I think we're going to give you the last question. And Moxley, if you would get in touch with us online, your question is a bit more complex than we can address in the time remaining. But we, Jeff or I could probably take a run at it. Sharon, go ahead.
I moved to Santa Fe from Las Cruces about 2 years ago. And one of the things I noticed was it really is like two states. And it's really quite bifurcated. Because I'm involved in the work around a public bank, I ended up meeting with the women that, the woman who does the SARS, the Sustainable Agriculture Research. And she mentioned that, in fact, for the first time, from larger farms. So I'm interested in whether there's any openness from what we would call agribusiness to the concepts that you're presenting.
Judith?
So the question is there openness among agribusiness to these concepts? This is a really, I would say the jury is out. There are many large product companies that, everything from Land O'Lakes to General Mills, that want to provide organic food and want to be able to say that their products are regenerative. But I don't know. I think a lot of people are asking that question and being skeptical about claims. It's a difficult thing because many agribusinesses are in business to sell these products that are very costly to producers and that undermine soil health. I mean, one just has to say that whenever you are using something with that ends in CIDE, it's killing something. And I'll just quote, I don't know if you know the farmer author Gabe Brown, that he says that when he was a conventional farmer in that agribusiness realm, you know, he used to get up in the morning and say, okay, what am I going to destroy today? What am I going to kill today? What pests do I have to worry about? What weeds do I have to worry about? And he says, since focusing on soil health and giving up those inputs, he gets up in the morning and says, how can I create more life today?
Thank you. We are running a little bit behind, so I'm sorry. Sylvia, if you'd like to type your comment into the chat, we could do that. Otherwise, and I need to go ahead and hand this off to Rob to close out. We were hoping to end exactly on time, but we're going to be going over just a little.
Well, I just wanted to first give Judith an opportunity for a closing comment, and then I'll conclude after that.
Okay.
Well, my closing comment is really thank you for the opportunity to chat with you.
Thank you.
We are so delighted, and you're so gracious with your time to volunteer to do this first webinar series with us. We are really appreciative of your commitment and the works that you have done, your books, and your life work is really appreciated. We're also very appreciative of the people who have dedicated their time right now during this webinar. You know, there have been about 50 people on the call, on the webinar most of the time, and many of those are still on, of course, and we're very grateful. And just in honor of Earth Day, I appreciate Judith's opening comments, how healthy soil leads to a healthy environment and a healthy planet, and also appreciate during these times of coronavirus the importance of health and human health, and the importance of taking care of our soil so we can take care of our health in the long term. So I just want to close by saying too that we're going to keep these soil stories going, and we're going to do one of these every month, if not more in the future, if we get a good response like this. And next month on May 19th, that would be a Tuesday, just like tonight, from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. We're going to have James Skeet, who's a Native American who's very committed in our state to healthy soil and has done a lot of work in this field. And he's going to share his soil story, his cultural perspective, as well as his biological perspective on soil. So we really invite you to to join us. And we appreciate all those who have asked questions and all those who, again, who've participated. So we look forward to having you again in May. And thank you so much, Judy, and everyone else for being involved in these.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Judy. And if anybody has any feedback on today, you've gotten an email from Isabel and you can send it to us through her.
Great.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Happy
Good
Earth
evening.
Day.
Yay.
Thank you for your
Yay.
time. Appreciate it.
Oh, sure, my pleasure.
Thank you.